Then there's California, our podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus discussing their lives, legislative priorities, policy, and other issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll be in conversation about what is one of the top social, legal, and health-related concerns of our lives. Domestic violence has reached epidemic proportions in our country. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced severe physical abuse by a partner. 50 women a month, are shot and killed by their partners. Domestic violence is the third leading cause of homelessness. And we're not just talking about physical harm. In some 20% of abusive relationships, a perpetrator has total control of his victim's life. As aware as we are of the crisis of domestic violence, it often plays out in the fringes and shadows of our lives, and seldom receives the attention and triage that is needed to address it. And as a result, victims, survivors, and family members often don't have many places to turn for help, and are frequently at the mercy of ineffective statute of limitations laws and a court system that doesn't take the domestic violence epidemic seriously enough. One tender mercy in this story is how domestic violence survivors are sometimes able to cycle the pain and discouragement of their experience toward empowering others dealing with and escaping similar situations. And an even greater mercy is when those survivors work to place themselves in positions of power and influence where they can push back against that paradigm of violence and humiliation and apathy and work to change laws and change lives. On Then There's California this time around, we are proud to be joined by 2 empowered survivors, community leaders, advocates, who are actually in a position to make a difference for domestic violence survivors and their families, so that others can have hope, so that others can be encouraged, so that others don't have to endure abuse or lose their lives trying. Shay Franco-Clausen is a mom, an activist, serving in many justice and advocacy leadership capacities in her home base of Santa Clara County, married to a law enforcement officer, and as she put it in one article, she is the L in LGBTQ.
Yes.
Susan Rubio is a freshman California state senator from the 22nd Senate District of California, representing the San Gabriel Valley. Where Senator Rubio has always felt most at home is in the classroom, where she was a teacher in the Baldwin Park and Monrovia schools for years. Before coming to the Capitol, Senator Rubio was a local government leader in the city of Baldwin Park. Senator Rubio is the chair of the Senate Committee on Insurance. And what allies both of these courageous individuals is a bond I know both would give anything to never have forged. Senator Susan Rubio and Shay Franco-Clausen are both survivors of domestic violence and are compelled by their experiences as survivors to bring encouragement and legal empowerment to other survivors. Senator Rubio, Shay Franco-Clausen, welcome to Then There's California.
Thank you, Brian, for having us here. And I'm really just honored to have Shay here alongside me to talk about such an important issue, not just to me and her, but to so many women across California. And so this year's priority for me is making sure that my bill, SB 273, which we named the Phoenix Act, not because of me. There's a whole coalition of women survivors who are working towards making it better for women. So I have to give credit to Evan Rachel Wood, who works with a group of women.
The actress Evan Rachel Wood.
The actress, yes. And they created the hashtag I'm Not Okay. And so they have been for years trying to advocate and change the laws. And I will start first with her powerful testimony in the Public Safety Committee, which really was quite impactful in my opinion. She talked about her experience having been tied up by her abuser, starved, sleep deprived, beaten, tortured with a device, and just the trauma she endured during that ordeal. And it took her years to get over that trauma, in particular because she was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. And she spent years trying to recover, heal. And it wasn't until she heard that her abuser was hurting another woman that she summoned the courage to come forward and try to do something about it. So I want to start with really giving credit where it's due and all the wonderful women that came together to try and put this together. And of course, you mentioned I'm a survivor as well. And so this was a good fit where we can all help each other make sure that lost our past, that give us a little bit more time to deal with what we experience and become healthier and be able to advocate. So this bill will do 3 critical things. Number one, it will extend the statute of limitations from 3 years to 10 years. As I just shared, Evan Rachel Wood's story, by the time she was able to come forward, her time had expired, and she had video, audio, and other evidence that she could have brought forth, but at that time it was too late. And what we want is we want women to know that it doesn't matter when it is, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, you still can come forward. And this is the only way we're going to get women out of the shadows and encourage them to speak up. I also wanted to add a component to this bill that would address police officers. I know that in many ways they want to be compassionate and understand victims, but there is no training that really talks about what they should look for. I will talk about my personal experience. There was a time where my abuser hurt me, and my sister was trying to take me to the hospital. She didn't know why. She was really desperate to get me out of the house. She knew something was wrong, so she called the police. So they went to get me, and at the time, I was so embarrassed. I had been a local elected leader, and the people coming to my door were essentially my police officers. So I had a really difficult time dealing with the fact that these are people that I work with who knew me personally. And the standard is that they always look at you to see if you have bruises over your body, and they knew something was wrong, but I was so embarrassed that I couldn't say what had happened to me. So they were checking my body for bruises, and they couldn't find anything. So because I didn't say what happened and they couldn't find evidence of what happened, they left and nothing came of it. And because I wouldn't say what had happened, they had no choice. But I can tell you, had they asked me to walk, they would have realized that I couldn't move because he dropped me on my back. And I was that hurt that I couldn't walk. But again, it's not something that they would know to do. So again, they were trying to be really helpful. They were encouraging me to say what had happened. They knew. It was just a matter of me telling the truth, and I didn't. But again, had they asked me to walk, it would have been quite obvious that I was seriously injured. So this bill also has a component that would educate law enforcement as to what else can they do to identify victims, and also share with victims where the resources are, and maybe do follow-up visits if they need to, just to ensure that women are okay. And again, we've never really talked about the follow-up visits, but it's something that I hope that we can get into in this bill. And lastly, I know that there's concerns that we might victimize men or innocent people that are being accused unjustly, but the bill is very clear that it has to be evidence-based and include audio, video recordings, or photographs. And I think like any other case, whether it's rape or murder, evidence still is a very big part of bringing an abuser to justice. So we're not trying to hurt anyone. We're not trying to falsely incarcerate anyone. This is really clear that it has to be evidence-based. And so now I want to give our friend Shay an opportunity to share a little bit of what she felt like, her trauma, because her personal story, I think, speaks to why this is so important.
Well, Shay, I'm really glad to have you here, and I appreciate you being able to share your story with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I think it takes a lot of courage and someone to be very brave to present this, especially in elected office, to share their personal stories. And I really thank you for standing up for victims throughout California, Senator. I really do.
Thank you.
I'm a native of San Jose. And the great thing about this bill is it has so many intersects. And when it comes to my story, I became an intimate partner of violence at the age of 9. But I went through my first abuse at the age of 12. And it wasn't like I volunteered. Someone made me a part of their intimate partnership. I didn't realize that being choked, being locked up, being beat, and being raped continuously was abuse because I lived in poverty. That was a standard in our community. And we're both women of color here, and we've been told in our communities not to say anything. So as I'm witnessing my aunts and my uncles experience abuse and seeing it firsthand, I didn't know how to report it because this was my normal. Fast forward from I'm a sex traffic survivor. It really is a segue into another relationship, which is domestic. So my first relationship, it wasn't until he broke my nose and cracked part of my face that I realized that this is not okay. And it was really at that point, but I still lived in a community that was over-policed. I'm still an Afro-Latina, that I was afraid to call the police because he knows where I live. He can break into my home. Who's going to protect me? And so throughout the years, I've had to live with that as a secret. I didn't even share it with my partner nor my children because our communities have been told to be shamed. We don't speak about the abuse. We keep it in our homes. And no one's going around to our communities telling us, like this bill will do, it will not only give us enough time to talk about our abuse, but it will also make sure that we get the education to know that we do have time to heal. We have time to talk about it, come to terms with it. My abuse went from 9 years old to 25. And through that time, I went to the police once, but I was terrified. And like you, I ended up saying when my face was broken that I fell down the stairs. Because I don't know what's going to happen. A piece of paper wasn't going to protect me because he knows how to get into my home. So I think the important thing is the reason why I'm doing it, and I can't speak to her, but I feel like it's the same, is we may not be able to get our abusers, but we will be able to make enough time, give them the resources for other women. If you're saying 50 women are being killed a month because of domestic violence, we have an epidemic. And we're very lucky that we have courageous senators that are willing to put their own story out there to help millions of women. So for me now, as a mother of 5 and married to an officer, the training for the police officers is so critical. Because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we weren't training officers to understand domestic violence. Or in our relationships, same gender as a lesbian, who do you take? Who's the abuser? But then also is that mental health. PTSD is so common in women that deal with this trauma. So now I've taken all that, what I've went through, and I'm the chair of the county's commission on the status of women and the chair of the justice and advocacy because the 500 women that are locked up in Elmwood, 70% of them are victims of intimate partner violence, human trafficking, and so on. Those are different ways that we can partner to have bills like this because if they're not there and we have only a little small window, we're not able to really come to terms with our own abuse.
And I want to just add a piece of information, which I think is really critical. And I think in the past we've also have said mostly women, but I want to make it clear that the numbers are growing in terms of men now being victims of domestic violence. So I want to also make sure that our men out there know that we're trying to also protect them. And when I went through my court case, as unfortunately I was an elected official, so was my abuser. It was so well publicized that it took me a little while to really come to terms with the fact that the entire world would know my intimate story. And so it does silence us in so many ways. But what came out of it is that when I started my court case and they started publicizing the story, I had messages from hundreds of women. They found me on Facebook. They found my email at City Hall, and they were sending me their personal stories. So I became somewhat of their confidant in many ways.
Was that frightening or overwhelming or inspiring?
Well, I spent a lot of time crying over their stories. I had to put my story aside, and I started sort of weeping over the fact that these women had been in abusive relationships for so many years. One in particular stands out to me. She said she was in her abusive relationship for 18 years, and I cannot imagine being really trapped in such an unhealthy situation for 18 years. And I believe Shay just mentioned that we are taught not to share what happens in our personal lives. We are taught to keep everything inside the house. And so for those women that were sharing their story, this was the first time that they had actually had the courage to tell someone. I had previous employees share their stories. I had a district attorney share her story. And this is also key. We are also taught to believe that women that fall victim are either drug addicts or perhaps uneducated. And clearly both of us are here to say that's not the case. I was a well-educated woman. I was an elected official. I knew it was wrong, but it didn't stop me from falling victim. Once you become involved in a relationship, it's almost like a snowball effect. You can't stop it, and you try to find ways to get out of it. And my personal circumstance, when I finally had the courage to try to get out of it, then he turned his threats towards my family. And that's also very common with abusers. When they can no longer control you, they turn the threats towards someone that you love, and they know that that may stop you from speaking up.
You bring up a very good point. In these situations, people come back, attack the survivors, the victims in abuse in terms of 15 years. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you just take off? And people not realizing that having to stay there to try to maintain a sense of balance or normal in a very dysfunctional and frightening situation is not a sign of weakness. People don't understand that length of time and not just walking out of it, you can't always do that.
Well, there's another factor which I dealt with. So because this is so personal to me, I will share how I felt personally. We're dealing with the fact that, as I mentioned, everyone's going to know your story. But for me, it was beside the point. I love my family very much. I loved his family very much. And I knew that a lot of people would get hurt. I knew that my mom and my father would be concerned. They would worry. I really struggled with putting this on them. We come from a very good household. My parents just celebrated 50 years of marriage. I didn't want to derail their dreams, and it felt that way, like I would be disappointing them in many ways. But I also recognized that I had fallen in love with his family. He was my husband, so my mother-in-law, his grandparents. I was also very well aware that the minute I spoke up, I would lose his entire family. And that's exactly what happened. When I did speak up, they never spoke to me again, and I could never call his grandma, who I loved, or his family, who I really had bonded with. So there's so many elements. It's not just the fear. It's just so many things that we're grappling with. But for me, it was so many pieces that it was really difficult when I finally came forward with my story. I did deal with the consequences of my mom constantly worried about me, and again, losing an entire family that I had grown to love.
And I echo that same sentiment. We all feel that we're going to lose something. My situation is a little bit different because I grew up in cycles of violence, and I wasn't well educated then. I grew up in the ghetto of our San Jose. But listening to you tell your story is, you have to think that women don't leave these situations sometimes because financially, the financial abuse, they know that they're the breadwinner. Right now, we're experiencing, we can see it across this nation, especially if you're an immigrant, you're afraid to report because you're afraid of ICE. Then you think about the children that are involved. Do you want them to lose their dad? He may beat me, but he doesn't hurt the kids. And then you're concerned about losing family members. The intersectionality of why women don't leave, it is not black and white. There's so many things that are connected to abuse psychologically, and that then changes your mental health. But it also, if not addressed, if we don't have enough time to come to terms and get our kids out and find safety, and we don't report it, we do not stop the cycle of violence in that home. You have now taught your sons and daughters to accept abuse as normal in the relationships. So I think that's a lot of reasons people don't leave. I didn't leave because I had nowhere else to go.
I'm glad we're starting to change the way we see things. And I want to just, if you don't mind, I'm going to change the conversation towards like the Me Too movement.
I wanted to talk about that, absolutely.
We had such a great year in terms of now victims of sexual assault in the workplace coming forward, telling their stories. But I still find a little bit of a disconnect. And I was so pleased to see how far we've come with the Me Too movement. I was pleased to see that so many women were coming forward, talking about their assault, their abuse, whether it was at work, wherever that might be. We started understanding that it was an epidemic. We started taking action as we saw so many men across our country had to step down due to allegations and accusations. But when it comes to domestic violence, I still feel there's a little disconnect. And I'll share what I personally think happens. I think what happens is that, again, all these years we're taught that what happens behind closed doors is none of our business. And now I hear from women who said they saw a neighbor for years with a black eye, and she left it alone, never questioned it. She would hear her screaming, left it alone, never questioned it. Because, again, we're taught if it happens behind closed doors in a family setting, it's none of our business. I still feel there's a little bit of that going on, where if it happened at work is almost an outrage. How dare they? But if it happened with an intimate partner, it's almost like, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to get involved.
Well, that's a very good point, because looking at the Me Too theme and movement, it's one thing to accuse someone of rape or harassment, but it's another thing to call out an abuser.
And for my particular case, it's not a stranger, it's someone that people work with, knew well, they knew me, and people just don't want to get involved. And so I'm trying to change that. I want everyone to understand that it is so critically important that you stand up, not to be a bystander, not to sit by while you hear screams in the next door or the neighbor yelling for help. And I hear that now from a lot of women. They're like in their 60s, 70s, that back in the 70s and 80s, it was common. It was common to hear screams coming out of people's houses, and you wouldn't investigate. You wouldn't call the police. So I'm just so glad that we're changing the conversation and encouraging people, not only victims, to come forward. My goal with this bill is to encourage victims to come forward, but also by way of this conversation, encourage bystanders to have the courage to stand up and try to get resources and defend the victim. And so hopefully people hear me and really have courage when they see someone hurt to come forward and do something about it.
I always echo that, the bystander syndrome and all these terms, intimate partner violence. I mean, they're new terms for a lot of people, but it's gone on for centuries in our communities. The bystander is the most important role that someone can play, because you can change the outcomes when she doesn't have the courage to do it. My family watched. My neighbors knew, my friends knew, but because it was common that we weren't to say anything. So everyone I knew as a bystanders, and that kept me quiet for 27 years. And when I testify, I said it took me 27 years to come to terms that I was a victim of domestic violence. It took me 27 years to even have the courage to share it with my partner. And it took me 27 years to speak it out into existence. But it's not going to take me another 27 years to change how laws protect women and men in this community from abuse. We have to stop making domestic violence be about gender or class or ethnicity. Domestic violence or any intimate partner violence has no gender, has no class, has no race. It can happen to anyone. And the sooner that we talk about this and pass this bill and educate our daughters and sons, we can stop the cycles of abuse.
So thank you for that. But I also want to add one more important aspect of this. Shay sort of discussed the family structure. There's a lot of women that are victims that have children. And I want to discuss one case in particular who is a constituent in my community. Her name is Ana Esteves. She was in an abusive relationship, and she had the courage to leave the abusive relationship, but she had a son, and the courts gave him joint custody. And she was screaming and yelling, please do not put my son in that abusive household. And the courts didn't see it, so they gave shared custody. And when her little boy would come home, he would say, Mommy, don't send me back. Daddy hurts me. She petitioned the court to please not send her child back. To make a long story short, her husband, in order to abuse her and torture her, murdered her little boy, 5 years old. 5 years old. They found him suffocated, and he had murdered his own son just to get back at her. That's how far an abuser is willing to go. And so children are affected by our actions as well. Children's lives are at stake as well. And so the more women speak up and the more bystanders speak up, we can help save that one life. And so that's important to note, because it's not just the adults and their relationship, it's also the children. And just to share how long we've come in terms of people starting to talk about things. When my abuse happened, it was a year before the Me Too movement. And I actually took my abuser to court. The judge actually ruled in my favor that I was telling the truth and my abuser did assault me and he was guilty of domestic violence. She ordered a 3-year restraining order. And the interesting fact is that my abuser was an elected official at the state capitol. He was able to finish his term. There wasn't an outcry and outreach and demanding that he step down, and he was able to complete his term. A year later, when the Me Too movement started happening, the cries and the screams for people to step down were loud, and I'm really encouraged by the fact that that did happen, but I was a little saddened that when it was happening to me, domestic violence versus the Me Too movement, I don't want to insult anyone, but really everyone stayed quiet. There were no loud cries for him to step down. There weren't legislators reaching out to me to see if I was okay. I was not only someone that you knew personally, I was an elected official. And no one said, what can we do for you? This is not okay. This is a crime. How can we help you? In fact, they did the opposite. They remained silent and let my abuser remain in office. So again, we've come a long way. So I want to make sure that people know that I am encouraged by the changes that we're making. And that's why this bill is so critically important. We have to make sure that women have the time to heal, come forward, and bring their abusers to justice. At this moment, if I chose to take them to court, I wouldn't be able to. My time is up. And that is the purpose of this bill, that we want to make sure women, no matter how many years it takes, that they can still speak up and bring their abusers to justice.
So indeed, it's personal.
Absolutely. And this is for all the women across California to understand that we're doing it for them. We're here. Maybe we are not there next to you to help you, but we want to pass this legislation so they know. They know that we are looking out for their best interests, and they could always speak up if given 10 years.
Your story describing what has gone on with somebody who's a member of the Capitol community here brings up a word in my mind: voice, for survivors, for victims who don't always have a voice in a story, but also the voice that's needed by people around, the eyewitnesses, the family members. They need to have a voice too. So clearly voice is a big theme in recovery and in dealing with these cases, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And as I sit here today sharing my story, I really want to make it clear that this is probably the first time that I've spoken so openly about this, and it's been years. And that just goes to show how long it takes for someone to heal. And for me, even though I'm an elected official, even though I did go through our case in court, I don't think I've ever really spoken this honestly about my situation. This is the first time I share how he dropped me on my back and I couldn't walk. And these details, little by little, I'm being encouraged by the women like Shay and the women from the movement I'm Not Okay, Evan Rachel Wood, who sat there so courageously and shared such a personal story. I'm encouraged by them as well. So.
And I'm humbled by you both being here to share these stories. And I love the name of your bill, actually, the Phoenix Act. The symbolism of that, as a survivor, resonates.
And just, again, because I want to give credit where credit is due, that name was given by Evan Rachel Wood. That was what she wanted to call this bill. And so let's give her credit. She really has been such an inspiration to me and to so many other women.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to touch on something. You are a teacher. And I know teaching is part of the love of your life.
Yes.
If you had any place else to be other than an advocate here at the Capitol, you would be in the classroom. And so much of the harm happens to young people. And the cycle of this begins at a young age, in families, in relationships. You, Senator, and Shay, you as well, I know part of your advocacy as survivors is educating young women and young men, independence, empowerment. Talk about your work for young people in the classroom and in our communities to prevent these kind of things happening in other families and relationships.
Oh, absolutely. Because I wanted to start with young ladies early on, I created a program. It's called WINGS. And the acronym, it stands for Women Inspiring the Next Generation of Sisterhood. And during these summits that I have, we have different components. And one is like financial literacy. Shay is right. A lot of the time women are dependent on their abusers, so they're not able to leave. And so we teach them financial literacy, how to become financially independent. We also teach another component, healthy relationships, what to look for, what are the signs, and if you find yourself in that situation, who do you go to for help? And so we teach so many different components at different times, but my goal is to continue to grow the program and make sure that we take it to different corners of the community and continue to educate and give a platform for even young ladies to share back. I've heard from a 15-year-old during one of my classes that she was a victim as well, and she could never talk to her mom about it. And so if we can't talk to our parents, we want to at least provide an alternative, other avenues where they can go to other trusted leaders and tell their story.
I agree. We talked about it before we came here, is how important is educating our communities. I've worked with so many agencies with the 49ers, especially the cycle of abuse that happens with athletes. I was a basketball coach for 22 years, and you can see the domestic violence even in sports from middle school, high school, into college. We created programs and we partner with organizations who are doing this work to have different components of teaching kids what are good relationships, what's one love, and not just that, but even as adults, like what is the relationship between parents and their children? So I've specifically used every space that I lead in, from the commission, from human trafficking summits to hosting a large event in October on Domestic Violence Month, to bring the many different age units that are in our communities, boys and girls, because we have to talk about domestic violence from both men and women, boys and girls, in order to break that cycle. So I think it's just in local advocacy. I want to work with WINGS. I don't want to bring WINGS to Santa Clara County, because we need to be talking about this not in a shameful way, but like as a normal conversation.
For those who could be listening to this, both of you here as survivors, you, Senator, as a legislator who is authoring legislation to help survivors and victims. What do you have to say, some words of encouragement and hope that maybe you didn't get when you were going through your situation?
Well, first of all, thank you just for giving us the opportunity to speak here today.
Absolutely.
I think my power also came from hearing other women's stories. As I shared, hundreds of women were sending me messages and what happened to them. And even though I still didn't have the courage to speak up, it was their stories, their power that encouraged me to speak up. So I hope that any young lady, man, woman, it doesn't matter who's out there listening, I just want to say it does get better. I know it doesn't seem like at the time, I didn't think it was going to get any better, but it does get better. And the key is finding that courage to find a trusted either friend or family member or organization. There are people out there that want to help you. So please come forward. You will be okay. It takes time, but you will be okay.
Sure.
I want to go on to say that I think it's very important about abuse and how we vote. We want to vote for legislators like this who have the courage to talk about something that we normally don't talk about. And I'd like to leave the message, and I hope a lot of people are listening, that this bill really needs to pass. This is the first step in our safety. This is the first step in giving us a louder voice. And it's the first step in letting people know, especially the women of California, that we care. And with Senator Rubio leading the way, I hope that other legislators are listening and they take this with the Me Too movement, with the Time's Up. Don't stand on the sidelines when you see abuse. But also with their vote, they can support Senator in what she's gone through and protect millions of California women by supporting this bill. I think that's what I'm really here for, is to back her up and make sure that we stand together with all the survivors and all the advocates and all the allies to make sure that we pass this, but also by passing it, it does send that message. It lets them know they are not alone.
Thank you both, Senator and Shay, for talking about something that, like you say, we don't always talk about. And I am humbled in so many ways by you sharing here, Senator, some of the details for the first time. And I can only hope that it brings some hope to somebody who happens to be listening. You are light in a very dark world, and hope your light keeps shining.
And my last thought is, please, let's stop victim shaming.
Yes.
We need to stop victim shaming. Thank you so much for your time,
you
and
so
happy
much.
to be
Thank
here.
you. Thank you for your time as well. That wraps up this edition of Then There's California. We are proud to have technical and production assistance and great ideas from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, John Roman, McClenna Woods, Aaron Kashishian, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. Everybody loves the bear. On behalf of Senator Susan Rubio of the 22nd Senate District in the San Gabriel Valley and Shay Franco-Clausen of Santa Clara County, from the state capitol here in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.